Incest. The very word makes us awkward. But throughout history, inbreeding and incest have been disturbingly common among royal families trying to keep their bloodlines pure. The results? Some of the most inbred human beings you can imagine, plagued by health problems and genetic defects. Want to meet the poster children for why incest is a bad idea? I've got a list that will make your skin crawl. Inbreeding, mating between closely related individuals, has been going on for centuries, especially among royal families who wanted to maintain the purity of their bloodline. But it often led to severe genetic problems in their offspring. I'm talking about things like infertility, insanity, malformed limbs, haemophilia, and diminished intelligence. Not exactly the qualities you want in a king or queen. Let me introduce you to 7 of the most inbred people in history. Their stories are pretty disturbing, but they perfectly illustrate why inbreeding is dangerous. It often results in disease, early death, and basically a genetic nightmare. After learning about these poor souls, you'll never look at royal families the same way again. Charles II of Spain was so ridiculously inbred that people said he was more like a successors than a human being. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents were uncle and niece, and for 16 generations before that, the Spanish Habsburg royal family only married each other. You know, keeping the bloodline pure. But this backfired big time on Charles. The guy was a mess from the moment he was born. He had severe epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, and was so disfigured he couldn't even chew food properly. His tongue was too big for his mouth, and he drooled a lot. He didn't learn to talk until age 4 or walk until 8. Historians describe him as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. His health was so bad that he died at only 38 years old without producing a successor. When you look at portraits of Charles, you can see why inbreeding was such a bad idea for the Spanish Habsburgs. Dude looked like a mutant. Speaking of ancient Egypt, let's talk about Ptolemy XIII. He was born to parents who were brother and sister, so incest ran in the family. Ptolemy XII inherited the throne at age 12 when his older sister Cleopatra became the sole ruler of Egypt. He was not happy about this and went to war against her, but he had bigger problems than power struggles with his sister. He was plagued by genetic health issues thanks to being inbred. Historical accounts say Ptolemy XIII had stunted growth, intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, and was homicidal and unpredictable. He ended up drowning in the Nile River during a battle with Julius Caesar's army at just age 15. Incest cut short the life of yet another Egyptian ruler. Now meet the Fugates. Secluded in the Appalachian hills of eastern Kentucky, the Fugate clan lived in isolation for generations, intermarrying with relatives to keep their family ties strong. This tight intermarriage allowed a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia to become prevalent among them. Methemoglobinemia, caused by a recessive gene, disrupts oxygen transport in the blood, lending skin a blue-tinged appearance. Martin Fugate, who settled in the Kentucky mountains in 1820, is believed to have carried this anomalous gene. As Fugates married other Fugates decade after decade, the likelihood of children inheriting 2 copies of the dysfunctional gene increased dramatically. By the 1960s, over 20 descendants of the Fugates were known to have blue skin coloring, earning them the label of the Blue Fugates. Sadly, the isolated community also experienced high rates of associated genetic problems like blindness, deafness, and mental disabilities. The inbred clan faced much discrimination from surrounding townspeople who derided them as blue-skinned freaks and failed to understand the tragedy of their condition. Speaking of blue bloods, let's cross the pond to Austria. Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna, better known as Marie Antoinette, was the Queen of France during the French Revolution, and her family tree was more like a wreath. She was the product of extensive inbreeding among German and Austrian nobles. Historians think this led to Maria Antonia's infertility, as well as physical problems like tuberculosis and seizures. At only 37 years old, she met her fate at the guillotine due to her lavish spending habits and poor leadership. While the French public hated her, it's likely Antonia's failed rule was at least partly caused by her faulty genetic lineage. Surprisingly, Inbreeding isn't just limited to ancient royal families. Even brilliant modern minds like Charles Darwin came from inbred lineages. Darwin was the grandchild of third cousins, and this family history seems to have led to health problems like chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal issues, and depression. Despite his poor physical health, Darwin's contributions to science and our understanding of evolution cannot be overstated. He was incredibly insightful for his time, publishing his groundbreaking On the Origin of Species in 1859. But you do have to wonder how much more successful Darwin's work may have been if not for his inbred roots. Moving on to another scientific virtuoso, none other than Albert Einstein. Einstein's parents were cousins, making him very inbred, and some historians think this is why he had a cognitive disability early in life. He didn't speak until age 3 and performed poorly in school as a child. Of course, Einstein overcame these difficulties to become one of the most influential physicists ever. His discoveries revolutionized science and ushered in a new era of astronomy, quantum mechanics, and more. Einstein is proof that inbreeding doesn't prevent genius. Though who knows how much greater his intellect might have been if his parents had better genetic diversity? Final example. The Colt Incest clan from Australia. In the 1800s, a man named Tim Colt left England for Australia with his wife and 7 daughters. Later on, 4 of his daughters returned to his farm with their own kids in tow. 13 children in total. And these kids were the product of uncontrolled incest. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. The result was horrific abuse and neglect. The Colt children had deformities, dwarfism, and mental impairments. It got so bad that authorities intervened in 2012 after a tip-off from a relative not engaged in the inbreeding. 40 family members were discovered living in an illegal camp in the Australian hills. Many of the children were placed in protective care. The Colts represent an extreme case of inbreeding gone horribly wrong in recent times. After reviewing these 7 examples spanning different eras and cultures, it's abundantly clear inbreeding can have devastating genetic consequences. While keeping bloodlines clean and family fortunes intact were priorities for historical royals, the price was steep. Beyond just royals, inbreeding has caused major problems, even in modern times when genetic diversity gets restricted for generations. So there you have it, a rogues gallery of the most inbred people in history. Their stories are equal parts fascinating and disturbing. If you enjoyed this stroll through the perils of inbreeding, be sure to like and subscribe to Unexplained Studios for more interesting content.